Asymmetrical Haircuts Justice Update with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg in partnership with justiceinfo.net.
A note to our listeners, the interviews in this episode were done in a noisy Lithuanian embassy building, so there is some background noise.
Hi, Steph.
Hi, Janet.
So sometimes it feels like this temporary exile that I have from The Hague, living in Vilnius, can actually pay off. Like the first week of October, when Lithuania is suddenly in the news around the International Criminal Court and Belarus. And it feels like all of this times that I've actually been following the democratic opposition from Belarus, who are doing various things because they've been pushed out to here in Lithuania, that all starts to make sense.
Yeah, but as usual, the action was in The Hague.
Oh, I know. I mean, you've got all the interviews with all the main players, so I'm just going to hand it over to you, Steph. Bit of Stephopedia, what are we talking about? And then maybe you can give me an inside description of what the Lithuanian embassy actually looks like, because I've been invited but never actually been there. Anyway, over to you.
So what happened is actually this story broke a day ahead of this press conference. I got invited to an event at the Lithuanian embassy that they were very secretive about. So I said, sure, this sounds like a good idea with Belarus in opposition in Lithuanian embassy. What can go wrong? There's going to be something interesting here. And the day before, suddenly news broke. It actually broke because Belarus had reacted to what was happening before we knew what was happening. So very news wire, we get a call like the Belarusian government is complaining about Lithuanian referral to the ICC. And we're like, wow. We haven't heard anything, but then started checking the sources in Lithuania. And what occurred is that Lithuania, an ICC member state, has referred Belarus, which is a non-member state, to the ICC for crimes against humanity, mainly deportation. And they're basing themselves on that Myanmar-Bangladesh precedent where the ICC can look into crimes that are partially committed on the territory of a member state. And deportation is one of these crimes because you have to move countries to prove deportation. And that referral was accepted. And the prosecutor said that they were opening preliminary examination.
So as a result of that, when you headed off to the Lithuanians, you already knew that there was something big that was happening because it was already on the ICC website also later.
Yeah. In a way, for me, it was the best situation because I could talk to everybody calmly and not have to run out and write stories, which is always very frustrating for me when I go to these big press conferences and they announce something big. It's really interesting, but then I have to get the story out as soon as possible. But now the story was out there, so I could just meet with the principals who were there because we also had the Belarusian opposition leaders there, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and her government in exile, and all the Lithuanian Minister of Justice and all these legal people to explain the nuts and bolts of the referral. And I had never been to the Lithuanian embassy either. It's nice, the Hague townhouse on the land van Meerdervoort, which is right next to Blossom, which is the favored coffee house of everybody who goes to the ICJ hearings, where I tend to run into a lot of ICJ judges. So it's kind of right next door. That was nice, but it's a very classic embassy. Everything is nice and carpeted, and there was very tasteful art on the wall, but in all very much an embassy like the embassies we usually go to. Not as super fancy because Lithuania is a small state. They didn't have one of the big villas that you sometimes see in The Hague, but this was more small affair, but very close to all the international justice institutions, fittingly.
Well, I can assure you that Vilnius itself is even classier. I'm sure it has its areas that have townhouses, but it's full of Baroque and probably an awful lot of very special furniture, which I've probably seen in places and haven't recognised. So make sure you do come and visit stuff. But what I'm now looking forward to is you actually taking us through, explain more of this thought process. Later in the podcast, I'll also add in the elements of a completely different approach to the ICC, which also concerns Belarus. It's also about the responsibility of state officials, but it's actually about the ongoing investigation into Ukraine. So we can come back to that later.
So what happened with Lithuania is that state parties to the ICC can officially refer a case, and they also brought the backup documentation and referred Belarus to the ICC. And I spoke to, and I'm going to need your help here, Janet, with the last name, because I can pronounce her first name. This is Gabia. but I always never quite know how to do the last name for Lithuanian. So
It's Gabija Grigaitytė-Daugirdę, who's the Deputy Minister of Justice.
she's the one who handed in the referral to the ICC, and I asked her, why is Lithuania specifically doing this?
Sometimes all you need is just that small crack in the wall, because justice is, with our initiative, I always say that we make sure that justice has no borders, that dictators, they cannot hide behind the territorial borders, behind the power, because the international law with the human rights evolution developed enormously. And, we have to use then the solutions that international law has to make sure, that it is not left for dictators to mock at.
Yeah. I mean, it all feels incredibly Lithuania. It's a small state, as you say. It's a scrappy, like, we're just going to go for things. We're going to be first at so many things, but perfectly poised and perfectly presented. Yeah, that sums up Gabija herself in so many ways.
Absolutely. And I've met her as well a couple of times in The Hague before this. And it's always very clear that Lithuania is up for this lawfare project in any kind of way they can do it. What was interesting for me about Tuesday's meetings, I also caught up with Svitlana Tikhanovskaya and asked her what the referral meant to her on a more personal level.
During these 4 years, we tried to open so many doors, and so many doors of different initiatives, of different organizations, institutions. Not all of them have been opened. And for me personally, it's like understanding that all the efforts will succeed if you don't stop. Because we maybe seeing that, some institutions are reluctant, or there is no political will, to punish dictators. And now it's like proof that if you're consistent in your policy, if you're hardworking, you will achieve results.
She was very, very obviously moved that this step was taken, but I did put to her that ICC jurisdiction is so narrow and there's so many other things that are going on in Belarus that can't be looked into through this referral, which needs these transnational crimes.
We understand the legal system, that Belarus is not part of the Rome Statute. We can't launch investigations on other crimes because it's in internal policy jurisdiction. And it's so good that we can launch special investigation at least regarding one issue, because it gives us possibility also to raise the issue of other crimes higher. But now we have possibilities what we have. We can't jump over the head, but we have to start from something.
To get a bit more to explore the narrowness and what the ICC can look at and what not, I spoke to Arif Abraham, who is a lawyer for Lithuania who works for Doughty Street, who helped put together the case. And we have a full 5 minutes of legal explanation. I did tell him that he could geek out a little with us about legal stuff. But we left it in because it shows the specifics of how they analyzed the case and how exactly they built it up and what are the underlying things that everybody's looking at.
The referral that's been made has been made on the basis that the principal crime against humanity that has been alleged is that there has been unlawful deportation. So obviously the civilian population in Belarus have been pushed across the border into Lithuania, but also other states' parties. And obviously that doesn't happen voluntarily. That happens because the civilian population was forced. And so immediately you are concerned with this particular aspect of deportation that is either direct expulsion or the threat of expulsion or what's known as other coercive acts or an environment in which coercive acts become permissive.
And Arif explained that following the precedent in the Myanmar-Bangladesh case, they also are trying to bring underlying unlawful acts that ordinarily wouldn't go to the ICC referral because Belarus is not a member state, but that they become relevant to show these transnational crimes like torture, which is happening in Belarus. And he argues about the consequences of torture and how that becomes then relevant for this case, this referral.
The consequence of denial of fundamental rights, enforced disappearances, sexual violence on a vast scale, arbitrary detention on a huge scale, all of these underlying elements begin to be part of the crime of deportation. And then there are two other aspects here. Not only are civilian population of Belarus, pursuant to this state policy to eliminate opposition, pushed into Lithuania and other states, they are done so specifically and because they are political opponents of the regime. So these patterned unlawful and underlying unlawful acts are highly discriminatory. They are being done because of this collectivity and this group being an opposition or being perceived to be opponents or critics of the regime. So you are then in the territory of the crime against humanity of persecution.
And he explains how this is happening in Lithuania, an ICC member state.
The state has become what I call a full spectrum authoritarian state, where they're using every single aspect of the machinery of the state to persecute them even further. So they are being pursued in Lithuania and other states. They are threatened of being political opponents. There is legislation saying that you cannot renew your passports or your right of re-entry into the country. Their families are being targeted in Lithuania and threatened. Their property is being confiscated. There is extraterritorial enforced disappearances and killings and torture. So essentially, these patterns of subjecting the Belarusian civil population to serious bodily and mental harm has continued, even though they've crossed the border. And so we fall into this territory of other inhumane acts. And the reason you fall into that category is that essentially large spectrum of the civilian population outside of Belarus are being rendered stateless. And they are rendered stateless because of these persecutory acts outside of the territory, in addition to them not having any prospect of being able to re-enter their home territory. And so you are in this situation, a continuous situation of harm and a continuing harm. And so you are in the territory of the third crime against humanity that has been alleged, which is the crime against humanity of other inhumane acts.
So, Steph, do you understand that this is charted or uncharted territory? You say there's the precedent of Myanmar, Bangladesh. The judges agreed to that in principle, but is it fully established that this is a way of getting stuff at the ICC?
Not quite yet. They've shown the way, but it is a bit of a here be monsters situation. We think that this is going to happen, but we're not entirely sure. And they brought in this complaint also a lot of the underlying crimes, which the judges in the Myanmar-Bangladesh case hinted at that they should also charge. But we don't know. It's not been tested yet by actual judges. There's no charges in this case. This kind of theory hasn't been put to the test. So it's going to be interesting to see how they do that.
I mean, Lithuania is a bit by itself doing this referral. And when I caught up with Gabia later, she she used a phrase like, lawyers have presented and now it's states to do something. I mean, is it your sense that any other states will join in this referral?
Well, I mean, it's certainly what Lithuania wants. In their little speech explaining what they did at the press conference, they're basically directly appealed to states saying, we have kind of this cookie cutter referral that you can hop onto. We've done all the groundwork. All you need to do is kind of sign your name to it and please do it. So I think I got the sense that they were in talks with other states, that they wanted other states to join them, but they went ahead and did this on their own to make the first step and are hoping that states will join.
It sounds like I've got something to ask some people at some of the diplomatic parties and things here to actually see whether, for example, the other Baltic states, Latvia and Estonia, feel like joining in. So keep going. Tell me more.
I asked her if there's any legal freak out or geek out situation that he wants to highlight. And he said, indeed, it's the first time that a state party refers a non-state party at the ICC.
Is that true? That's an interesting way of seeing it.
Well, I mean, the situation in Palestine was referred, but of course, Palestine under ICC rules is a state party. So in a way, the Palestine referral is seen as states putting in Israel.
And what about Myanmar, Bangladesh? Isn't that the non-state party?
Yeah, absolutely. But it wasn't Bangladesh that referred the case. It was a proprio motu investigation by the prosecutor. I think there were some NGOs pushing for this. And then the prosecutor decided themselves. So that's a different situation. This is, in a way, Lithuania not out of the blue, but referring that very specifically.
And what else did he reveal to you that, as a fellow legal geek, he was interested in?
Well, because he does a lot of these kind of cases and he sees a lot of war crimes cases. And I asked him if there was anything specific that stood out to him or that he was surprised by in looking at this file. And he said the total repression that Belarus is showing and every avenue they're taking is really what made him want to get stuck in and get this case before the ICC.
I think the thing that, in a way, it's novel, but it's also shocking. It's one of the rare occasions where I've seen a state leaving no stone unturned in terms of pursuing their opposition. Essentially, you can look into the legislation, the policies, the practices of the state almost every week or almost every month, and you will find new measures of repression, new ideas, creative ways to clamp down on dissent, new ways to utilize torture, inhumane or degrading treatment. And it really is a full spectrum response, authoritarian response to opposition and dissent. And in fact, even when you've looked at the facts and assessed them and analyzed them and constructed a statement of facts, you are somewhat shocked as to the level and scale of the severity of that response. And actually, you wouldn't believe it if somebody had put this in a novel or something, that an authoritarian response could be so comprehensive. You'd doubt that it could happen or be true. So that's one aspect that I guess has kind of compelled me to act on this and represent the Lithuanian government.
Thanks, Steph, for bringing that all back from the meeting that you went to in The Hague. I just also wanted to mention briefly, but then maybe go into some of the legal, again, background stuff on this. I've been looking at the evidence that some Ukrainian NGOs, together with some Belarusian NGOs, have taken to the ICC, specifically about Ukrainian children who are being transferred from the occupied territories of Ukraine to Belarus.
We did a podcast before on that with Julia Joffe and Nathaniel Raymond of the Yale Observatory, especially on children transferred from Ukraine to Belarus and Russia through Belarus. And Gabi also mentioned that Lithuania had also filed separate documentation that they had gathered about the transfer of Ukrainian children to Belarus, but that's a separate affair. And very specifically, this complaint is focused on the, I guess, persecution of political activists, Belarusian political activists, many of whom are now in Lithuania.
Yeah, this is about the children who've been transferred to Belarus, and apologies to anybody who's going to feel a bit confused, because we are talking about different collections of evidence and a different crime base and so on and so on. So let's just kind of tease that out. In this case, in fact, these legal teams from the NGOs, they specifically don't want to call it enforced deportation or transfer, because there's the issue of war crimes. So we'll come back to that a bit later. They do want to categorize it as a crime against humanity of persecution by discrimination. So I thought it would be useful to start with some of our definitions, Steph, the ones that we always do, 101 for fellow journalists. War crimes, as we know, have to be connected to an armed conflict. Crimes against humanity have to be against civilians, have to be widespread, systematic. Genocide has to have special intent to destroy in whole or in part one of the specific protected groups. So with Julia, who's actually at the Queen Mary College at the moment in London, she's been looking at this whole sphere around children, Ukrainian children, and what's been happening to them. And she's been summarizing it for different international bodies.
Whether it's a war crime, whether it's a crime against humanity, whether it's a genocide, CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, I didn't just make a case for, even I personally think it's genocide, but I've been also took quite a beating about trying to argue that it's genocide. But anyway.
Yeah, but not from us, Julia, not from us.
Not from us, not from you, from others. I think generally, and I think I've mentioned this with genocide specifically, with forcible transfer of children, it's tricky because of the question of destruction. Not even necessarily the intent, but destruction and what destruction actually means. is it physical destruction? Because the narrow interpretation is that there should be physical destruction, and in forcible transfer, there is never physical destruction. So one argument that I tried to make in my article is that it's not necessarily biological destruction of the individuals themselves, but of the nations. Because if 700,000 children is correct, it's 10% of Ukrainian nation, and it's about the future generations.
The figure she mentions for 700,000 sounds really high.
It really is, isn't it? But actually, from the Russian side, from somebody you may have heard of before, Stephanie, it's Maria Lvova-Belova. I think that's how you say her name. And who is she?
She is of ICC arrest warrant fame. She is the Russian commissioner for children who is on the arrest warrant with Putin precisely for forcible transfer and deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia.
Yeah, the Russians really want to celebrate the idea that they're actually saving Ukrainian children from war. So maybe they're exaggerating the figures a bit. From the Ukrainian side, the current estimate is around 20,000 children. But Yulia pointed out to me that the figures haven't been updated for the last 10 months.
So what's the problem, according to Yulia, with describing what is happening as genocide? Because as we know, transfer of children of one group to another group is one of the genocidal acts mentioned in the treaty.
So here we get a little bit technical with Yulia.
But destruction is the problem, especially with ICJ jurisprudence, and also because forcible transfer has never been properly litigated. And probably my feeling is that it won't be litigated by Ukraine in ICJ. I don't think they want to bring a genocide case with regard to Ukraine specifically.
So, of course, she's talking here about the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, rather than the ICC. And she's mentioning them as this kind of ultimate place to help define international law and to help interpret the Genocide Convention. And she's talking about Ukraine's own state lawfare policy. But I think it's interesting because this is something to be considered as to whether the ICC itself also would potentially take the genocide route in terms of how it would define the alleged crimes against Ukrainian children.
Again, the problem with the genocide argument, and again, I don't insist on it because there's not enough case law internationally. And it would be great if Ukraine brought the case against Russia on Genocide Convention, particularly with regard to children. But it doesn't look like it's going to happen, or that's my feeling from just talking to people. I don't have any internal information, but I think that there is some advice that's given to Ukraine that ICJ interprets genocide very restrictively. And because of this issue, especially with destruction and intent, if it doesn't find that there's a genocide, a lot of people in Ukraine will be very disappointed, including victims. So there's hesitance there in bringing this case. I was also hoping that the ICJ would just clarify this point more legally for other forcible transfer, but I'm not sure it will going to happen.
So what about Belarus itself? What legal framework can we actually apply there to start with, using the term war crimes, and any crimes that come under the Geneva Conventions might be quite difficult?
With regard to Belarus, and my work mostly I've looked at Russia, but with Belarus, it's a bit tricky because there's a question whether Belarus is a party to armed conflict. And because war crimes can be committed only during the war. And there's different issues about deportation, specifically war crimes, is that it's Geneva Convention 4, right? Article 49 and additional protocol, Article 78. So for Geneva Convention number 4, it's also a question of, it can be Article 49 violation is a violation that can exist only with regard to occupying party. It's clear that Russia is an occupying state. It's really unclear if Belarus is an occupying state. But it can be complicit in occupation. So when I was thinking about it, I thought myself that it's easier than go into weeds on this very difficult questions, fact-based, to just focus on crimes against humanity. Yes, because you don't need, again, armed conflict connection nexus, etc.
So the legal researchers that I spoke to, the ones from Zmina and the Regional Centre for Human Rights in Ukraine, they went for discriminatory persecution as a crime against humanity under the Rome Statute. And they argue that the children themselves are vulnerable, They are in a very difficult situation, being forced to go from the Ukrainian occupied territories to Belarus. They're being forced to absorb a lot of Russian propaganda there, and then sometimes they come back to Ukraine, sometimes they go to Russia, sometimes if they're old enough they end up in the military. But there's this whole sense that they are being discriminated against on the basis of them being young enough to be kind of forced into being Russian.
Yeah, intimidation and the trying to brainwash sounds a lot like some of the elements of the Lithuanian referral, but of course slightly different in different groups, but the same legal conclusion of this kind of overall persecution method that the Belarus government allegedly has.
Yeah, and it's also allegations against Belarus state officials. Now, just to let you know, these NGOs that I spoke to, they met directly with the Office of the Prosecutor, and the Office of the Prosecutor was interested in their analysis as part of the Ukraine investigation. So let's see. Now, they would like to kind of characterize the facts that they have gathered as potentially intent by Russia to commit genocide or maybe committing genocide. I don't know whether that will fly. They don't know whether that will fly. That wasn't what they are arguing at the moment in this report, but let's see. I don't know whether that would fly at the ICC. But again, it's one for us to watch.
Exactly. I think every podcast we kind of, nothing is ever finished up. We're always continuing to watch. So one other little strand that I wanted to pull on, which is very briefly another possible legal route of doing something with Belarus, is that Lithuania has also started the beginning of saying that they have a dispute with Belarus over something, which could potentially lead to maybe ICJ cases or arbitration cases. So they're looking at every possible angle, and there's people who would love to see this turn into an ICJ case. And then again, are you doing anti-discrimination? Are you maybe looking at the torture convention? All kinds of things then open up for possible other cases. So we might also get the ICJ involved in for Belarus, but that is very, very down the line, it seems. But I felt there was some hints that maybe they were going to do that as well.
I have this strong sense that we are going to have to brush up on our treaties at some point, Stephanie. Beyond international criminal law, we're going to have to know some of the treaties like the Convention of the Rights of the Child, the Torture Convention, and that one that's got a funny acronym, CEDAW. That's come up already. We're going to have to know these treaties inside out as well as everything else.
Well, I mean, I covered some of the ICJ cases with the anti-discrimination and the torture convention, so I'm slightly brushed up on that. So let's see. But there's also novel kind of ways to bring these cases. And now I'm going out on an entirely different limb. But the Nicaragua-Germany case about giving weapons to Israel also invokes the Geneva Conventions at the ICJ. So there's all kinds of novel ways to get states involved in conflict or persecution somehow to the ICJ. So we never know what's going to happen. So I think this is an on-the-job learning situation.
Just a very small aside, adding to the end of this particular podcast. After the recording with Yulia, she contacted me to say that Alexandra Romantsova, the executive director of the Centre for Civil Liberties, said at an event in London this week that her organisation is working with Lithuanian colleagues to try to join the case of Ukrainian abducted children to Belarus to Lithuania's ICC case about the opposition figures who've been affected by Belarus. So, I mean, my goodness, let's see whether that's possible. Let's see how this may all possibly collide together in some form in The Hague. And finally, we should take the opportunity to say thank you to those people who've signed up to our Patreon. Let's just run through them. To start with, there's Ellie Smith. She's actually from Bournemouth and she works on mass graves. So thank you very much, Ellie.
And there's Kathy Voiles, who I don't know the details about, but we're very welcome. Very welcome to you, Kathy.
Eliza Borbelli, she's one of our newest interns.
And somebody who I think probably has a stage name, because I don't think Crazy Me Boo is an actual name, but who knows? Let us know if you're listening to this.
And Catherine M. Stanford. Thank you very much, Catherine. You're also a paying member, for which we appreciate very much.
Kevin Lauk II also signed up for the free newsletter.
And Raha Bahraini. So please go ahead, sign up. You get our free newsletter and you get access to some of our posts on Patreon. And if you become a paying member, then you can also hear the War Criminals Book Club.
Thank you very much.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast. Created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie Vandenberg. This episode was created in partnership with justiceinfo.net, an independent site covering justice efforts for mass violence, and with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.